Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into the absolutely fascinating, entirely invisible rules of survival that govern literally every living thing in our natural world. You know, if you've ever walked through a quiet, old-growth forest, or maybe just looked down at a stubborn little weed pushing its way right through a crack in a concrete sidewalk, you might have wondered why life takes on so many drastically different forms. Well, we're going to break down the incredible evolutionary strategies that dictate exactly how species survive, how they reproduce, and ultimately how they go about conquering their environments. It really comes down to a fundamental question. Why do some species live for mere weeks, just blazing through their entire life cycle, while others stand as these silent sentinels, living for centuries? The answer? It's all about energy. Nature is an intensely competitive arena, with strictly limited resources. Every single organism on Earth has a finite amount of energy to spend, kind of like a budget. And the ecosystem forces these species to make a crucial evolutionary choice. Do they spend their energy chips on growing massive and strong, or do they spend it on making as many offspring as possible, as quickly as they can?
To really wrap our heads around this, let's look at a classic continuum proposed by scientists Robert MacArthur and Edward Wilson back in 1967. They brilliantly illustrated this concept using the humble dandelion and the towering oak tree as our ultimate biological competitors. These two plants basically represent the extreme ends of a vast spectrum of survival strategies. They're playing the exact same game of survival out in the wild, but they're playing it with entirely different rulebooks.
On one end of the spectrum, we've got what scientists call R-selected species. The R here just stands for a high rate of per capita population growth. These are species with unbelievable growth rates, but they actually have pretty poor competitive ability when they're forced into a prolonged fight for space or nutrients. This is your ultimate live fast, die young strategy, perfectly embodied by biological weeds. Their entire existence, every single ounce of their biological programming, is optimized for explosive growth the absolute second an opportunity presents itself.
To pull this off, our selected species have evolved specific traits tailored perfectly for disturbed habitats. Picture a sudden gap in a dense forest canopy. Maybe a massive tree just blew down in a storm, suddenly letting a bright shaft of sunlight hit the dark forest floor. Well, the R-selected weeds are the ecosystem's first responders. They rush right in. They grow incredibly fast, they reproduce early, and they devote almost all their available energy into producing huge numbers of tiny seeds that can just scatter widely on the wind. Because they invest absolutely everything into immediate reproduction, they stay pretty small physically, and the individual plants don't live very long at all. They basically win the game of survival through sheer overwhelming volume.
Okay, so on the completely opposite end of this continuum, we find the slow, steady, and extremely patient strategy, the K-selected species. The K here stands for the carrying capacity of the environment. These guys have incredibly stable populations that are perfectly adapted to exist in highly crowded, highly competitive real estate. They do not rush, they take their sweet time. Think of the majestic, mighty oak tree, standing tall and immovable in a mature, perfectly undisturbed forest.
So instead of rushing frantically to reproduce like the weeds do, K-selected species thrive in these stable environments by investing heavily in their own personal survival and physical size. They grow slowly. They build incredibly deep roots and rock-solid trunks. They actually reach reproductive age quite late in life. And when they finally do reproduce, they produce far fewer seeds. But those seeds, like a heavy, thick, nutrient-packed acorn, are large and contain massive food reserves. It's like giving their offspring an incredibly strong biological trust fund. This monumental investment in size and strength allows them to eventually spread their branches, shade out the competition, and totally dominate those smaller, faster-growing weeds.
When we put these strategies head-to-head, it is just brilliant to see how these organisms are making completely different evolutionary bets to ensure their genetics survive an unpredictable world. The R-selected bet, it's all about volume and speed. You're scattering a million tiny seeds to the wind and simply hoping one lands in a good, fertile spot. The K-selected bet is the exact opposite. It's all about quality and endurance. You build a massive, unmovable physical structure and give just a handful of offspring the maximum possible amount of resources to ensure they survive literally whatever nature throws at them.
Ecologist Eric Pianka mapped these traits out even further back in 1970, showing how every single aspect of an animal or plant's life is inextricably tied to this central strategy. For R-selected species, there's rapid development but incredibly high mortality for the young, meaning most of them tragically just don't make it. Their population sizes swing wildly from boom to bust, but their dispersal ability is fantastic. Now, K-selected species are the exact inverse. Incredibly slow development, remarkably low mortality for their well-protected young, highly constant population sizes, but terrible dispersal ability. They just stay put and fiercely fight for their chosen spot. And hey, this doesn't just apply to plants. Across the animal kingdom, things like insects are generally R-selected, while large, magnificent mammals like whales or elephants are heavily K-selected.
Now, here is where our story takes a pretty tragically urgent turn, because human dominance on this planet has completely rewritten the rules of this ancient evolutionary game. For literally millions of years, both the R and K strategies were equally viable ways to survive. But the arena? It's dramatically changed.
In our modern, human-altered world, K-selected species find themselves at grave existential risk. Consider the number 22. Right now, there is only enough publicly owned land in South Florida to support about 22 Florida panthers. Because they are a K-selected species, they require huge, vast, completely undisturbed territories to hunt, breed, and establish themselves. As we relentlessly shrink and fragment their natural habitats, their numbers plummet to terrifyingly low levels.
This creates basically a perfect storm of vulnerability. Almost every single trait that makes K-selected species such strong, dominant competitors in a wild, natural world makes them incredibly fragile in our human-dominated one. They need massive tracts of habitat, which we're rapidly logging, paving, and developing. Plus, they produce very few offspring. Take the magnificent California condor. It produces only a single chick every other year. This means if a population drops sharply due to hunting, pollution, or habitat loss, their biological recovery is painstakingly, dangerously slow.
To really put that slow breeding into perspective, just think about the elephant. The gestation time for an elephant is a staggering 22 months. That is almost 2 entire years just to carry a single calf. And after that, it takes them at least 7 years just to hit sexual maturity. They simply cannot replace their population fast enough to keep up with human disturbances. The slow and steady bet is unfortunately losing out to the chainsaw and the rifle.
Now, while the R and K continuum is an incredibly powerful tool for understanding nature's basic strategies, science is, of course, always evolving. Researchers eventually realized that nature is infinitely complex, right? It requires a bit more nuance than just drawing a straight line between a fast-growing weed and a slow-growing oak tree.
So in 1977, plant ecologist Philip Grime introduced a really fascinating new framework. He proposed a triangular model to show that species actually trade off between 3 distinct strategies based on competition, disturbance, and environmental stress. Ruderals are just like our R-selected weeds, aggressively jumping into highly disturbed habitats. Competitors are like our K-selected oak trees, slowly dominating those stable environments. But then he added a third point to the triangle: stress tolerators. These are incredible, resilient species like cacti surviving in the scorching desert or mangroves clinging to life in salty coastal marshes. You see, an organism can't be good at all 3. If you're spending all your precious energy chemically tolerating intense salt or extreme heat, you biologically cannot also outgrow a competitor. It is the ultimate evolutionary trade-off.
So whether you look at it as a straight binary line from weed to oak, or a highly complex triangle of interconnected traits, these theoretical frameworks show us exactly how incredibly fragile the balance of our ecosystem truly is. Our entire planet relies heavily on this intricate diversity of life history strategies to bounce back from natural disturbances, to cycle nutrients, and to maintain long-term environmental stability. It's like a giant biological puzzle.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway for this explainer. As we relentlessly continue to shrink natural habitats, pave over ancient forests, and fundamentally alter the globe, we have to look closely at the math of survival and ask ourselves a really critical question. What happens to the stability of our entire planet if human impact causes all the slow and steady K-selected species, our majestic whales, our wise elephants, our ancient giant sequoias, to just disappear forever? It's a profound, haunting question about the future of our most majestic, long-living species. And honestly, it's one we desperately need to figure out the answer to before our time runs out.
Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Stay tuned.